Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar on gamifying DBIR findings for faster risk reduction. This, I hope, will be an excellent webinar if you're a practitioner and if you wanted to deep dive into the data behind the vulnerability findings in DBIR. And I wanted to welcome you. We have folks from the three continents today. We have an excellent line of speakers. Just a quick housekeeping item before we get started. There is a Q&A bar on your webinar screen. Please input your questions as you have them. And I promise that at the end of the webinar, we'll be taking them one by one. We want to get through as many questions as possible. So you could feel free to enter your questions as you think about them. So today for this webinar, we have lined up two Gen AI bots that look like humans, they speak like humans, but they're actually not humans. And I'll let you figure out who's who. But that's jokes aside. We actually have great speakers. We have Alex Pinto, who is the author of DBIR, and we have Aravind Iyengar, who is the head of AI at Balbix. Alex, I want you to introduce yourself first. You're a real person, right?
As far as I know, yes. So thanks for having me, Umang. So like you said, I'm one of the co-authors of the data breach investigations report at Verizon. I'm the team lead, been doing that for, oh my God, almost 6 years now. And yeah, it's quite a ride. It's been really, really great to be able to kind of tell the story of what's happening and focus on the threat landscape and how it's changing over the years.
Awesome. And Arvind, you're here too. So tell us who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Umang. Yeah, very happy to be here. So my name is Aravind Iyengar. I am VP of Engineering here at Balbix. I lead the AI team. I've been doing this for close to 5 years now, and I've been looking at all the things VM related from the angle of data science and AI for this time. So happy to share a few insights from that perspective.
Awesome. So Alex, without further ado, let's get started. I'll turn it over to you to first kick us off. But I would think everyone knows about DBIR. I've been reading it for the past 10 years, if not longer. And as you mentioned, you've been a part of this yourself. You've been in the driver's seat for so long. You've seen everything related to data breaches, and you have seen all kinds of data. I wanted to know what's been the most surprising finding for you this year?
Well, let's get started from the beginning, right? So the data breach investigations report is something that Verizon has been putting together for 17 years now. And back in 2008, it was a really, really novel concept for having a kind of a security consultancy put out a report about what's going on the threat landscape. And now, I mean, everybody does it. Which is fine. I think it's important to have as many different voices and perspectives as possible, right? But the interesting thing about this report and the reason why we enjoy it so much, and I enjoy so much working on it, is that we're blessed to have so many different data contributors that work with us in order to put this data together. And so the report doesn't always put doesn't just have Verizon perspective, but collects data from several different companies and from incident responders, folks who do phishing simulation, folks who do malware analysis, and in your case, vulnerability management, right? Balbix was one of our most important partners over this last year and allows us to do some of the research that that we put together now. And to your point, the most interesting finding that we had to do with vulnerability management. So explicitly, the thing that was the most interesting for us had to do with how many vulnerabilities were responsible for the specific findings on data breaches, right? So let me share you a little bit of what we have here, right? So you can get an idea of what I'm talking about.
Glad to have influenced your thinking.
Don't know about influence. Maybe some thinking was involved. Okay, I should have done the opposite. Not much thinking was involved. So anyway, so here's the big thing, right? The big finding and the big thing that brought us a lot of attention in the work that we've been doing. So over the years, we've been tracking what we call the ways in metric, right? And that is really about what is the initial step? What is the first thing that the attackers do in order to get into an organization? And well, use of credential abuse has always been number one ever since we started tracking this metric. But the interesting thing that we found this year was that the exploitation of vulnerabilities grew significantly in relation to the past year. So it almost tripled in volume as one of the initial, what is the initial access vector into a breach. So went from 5-ish% to 14-ish%. And this is, again, massive growth, still overshadowed by credentials, right? It's important to have that in perspective, but if there is a time to be able to focus and shift on vulnerability management and other types of mitigating procedures you can have associated with vulnerabilities, this is really the time to look at it, because it seems to be a trend that has really spiked over the last year. And from the data we've been collecting so far this year, it doesn't seem like it's slowing down. And so the kind of the main culprit here were a big selection of zero-day or near zero-day vulnerabilities that ransomware actors were using. And the chief of all, the one who sadly got the kind of the fame for all of it, was the MoveIt file server vulnerability, right? It's usually being used in the industry as a shorthand for this kind of wave of 0 days we had, which again drove a lot of these ransomware related or similar breaches, right? So this was something that really caught our eye, and we decided to dig a little bit deeper on vulnerability management data to kind of understand how does the challenge here, how are we meeting this challenge in our environment? And it turns out that when we're analyzing vulnerability management data, including Balbix data, which, like I mentioned before, was one of our partners this year, we could be doing a better job. So we did a survival analysis of the CISA non-exploited vulnerabilities catalog, which is by and large accepted over the past couple of years as, oh, these are the critical ones. So these are the ones that you should be focusing the most at. And what we found was that at 55 days, around 50% of the critical vulnerabilities were still unremediated, right? Of course, the devil is in the details, in the sense that, you know, maybe you patch the 50% you should be patching first, right? But I mean, there's a lot of art in this science as well. But nevertheless, the thing that came out to us, really the finding that popped into our faces, was that if the number was 55 days for half of the vulnerabilities, we also found that when you look at exploitation data, so mass exploitation data from internet-wide honeypots, the first scan for, again, a vulnerability from the same bucket, from the non-exploited vulnerabilities catalog, it had a median time of 5 days to start from the vulnerability being disclosed, right? So vulnerability was published in CVE. So 5 days from the publication of the CVE, half of those vulnerabilities there were already seeing some action in mass exploitation. That, of course, means all the 0 days were before the zero, right? You can think about the bell curve, having the center on the 5 there. As we mentioned before, was a significant finding that we had. So it really puts in perspective how challenging this is on a day-to-day, and how crucial the fine-tuning and the understanding of your strategy when you're doing vulnerability management is to even those odds, right? You only have so much time to patch at the end of the day, so you really need to be really good at choosing what you're going to be patching first. So just want to close this thoughts about the report, talking about kind of the outcomes, right? And overwhelmingly, the outcomes of those breaches had to do with either ransomware or some sort of pure extortion techniques. And by that, we mean those attacks where ransomware actors, they would get in, they would exfiltrate the data to do their website ransom, but they just didn't encrypt. They didn't even bother encrypting, right? So technically, with ransomware has a lot to do with the encryption part. So it's kind of splitting hairs a little bit, if it's ransomware or not. So we just decided to report those two things together, right? And we're seeing them being present on almost a third of all breaches. But yeah, I mean, it's the growth of vulnerabilities was pretty significant, right? And I'm glad I have this opportunity to talk about it with you folks, right? Again, source of part of this data that we used, and folks who have been doing this for a short while. So I'm sure there's some very interesting insights you folks would be interested in sharing about how can we look at this and how can we interpret this from a practitioner perspective, right? So I'm gonna stop sharing here. And yeah, back to you, Mang, or Arvind, if you want to start, please be my guest.
Yeah, thanks. This is great. Thanks for sharing, Alex. I do have some questions, but I'll hold it off to the end. And I want to transition over to Arvind because, you're in your role. I think you have two advantages. You look at all the data about vulnerabilities from a deeper lens. So I'd love for you to share if, you could double click on the data that Alex presented to talk about what we see. And then I think you're in a unique position because you're also building solutions for those problems using some of the cutting edge AI. So I'd love to go out of the problems statement at some point and also talk about what's the way forward for us? What's the way forward for anyone who's looking at the data and saying, I get the data. It sounds like vulnerability being exploited at a faster rate and it's growing. What do we do now?
Absolutely. So first, let me bring up my slides here. Just give me 1 second. All right. So I think two tidbits of information that Alex shared stood out for me in this year's findings. And the first of it was an uptick in use of vulnerabilities as an initial access, exploiting vulnerabilities to penetrate networks. And the second one was the time window, the shrinking of the time window within which that is happening. And so what both of those in conjunction mean is that not only is there a larger volume of issues that are getting exploited, but they're also getting exploited in a shorter time. So the density of exploitation is compoundedly increasing. And that brings us to a core part of what is included in vulnerability management, which is prioritizing vulnerabilities and prioritizing them right. And I just wanted to sort of go through the generations of how this has been approached by the community at large and talk about it from the lens of data, like you said, Umang. Obviously, the first generation of these approaches were kind of CVSS-like approach. And primarily, I think this was proposed at a time when a common language for communicating about vulnerabilities was still proposed and being adopted. And in terms of the CVE spec, and the scoring system in itself primarily relied on basic vulnerability related attributes, where it was exploitable from, how easy it was to be exploited, what kind of a compromise is feasible. And anything else outside of the realm of vulnerabilities was assumed to be actively present in the worst case. So in a sense, these approaches took a conservative stance. And if you actually look at the data, it is revealed in it, because if you now look at a histogram of the CVSS scores across the universe of CVEs in this case, um, there is a heavy skew for this distribution to the right. A large number, a large fraction of vulnerabilities have a large score. And if you transform this into a proportion, a complementary CDF, which is basically, if you look at the 90th percentile point here, uh, what this means is about 90% of the universe of CVEs score close to 4.5 and above. About 50% of the universe scores almost 7 and above. And so the traditional approach of taking a conservative stance will effectively lead to something like, for a typical larger enterprise, or Fortune 500 like enterprise, and magnitude of vulnerabilities, where if you look at unique CVEs, there's about 20,000. If you look at the number of occurrences or instances of these CVEs, there's about 4 million. And these are peppered around 120,000 assets, very large numbers. Uh, the situation is not particularly better for a smaller enterprise. It's not suddenly the case that things become more concentrated there. It's equally challenging. 1,200 CVEs, unique CVEs, 25,000 instances affecting 1,500 assets. So this is typically what we've observed to be present across enterprise networks. What this means is that this kind of an approach, while it made sense perhaps when this was initially proposed, where both the volume of such vulnerabilities was smaller, the rate at which they were incoming was smaller. In today's world, where with 30,000 new CVEs being uh, published every year, which is something which amounts to something like 150 CVEs per workday. This is a very overburdening and a very inefficient approach. And relying on this alone has been a fundamental challenge, because most of VM operational mechanisms, unfortunately, still rely on CVSS-like mechanisms and are fundamentally inefficient and due to this. So therefore, what we need to do, I guess, is a couple of different things. First, focus on what matters. And I think this is where, Alex was also pointing out, CISA KEVs has definitely been something that people, community at large has centered around as being a strong indicator of threat intent and imminent threat being present for any enterprise. There's also other mechanisms such as the exploit prediction scoring system. Um, these kind of threat signals, they are fundamentally designed to polarize vulnerabilities. Polarize in the sense of something that needs to, that is potentially being exploited or is already seen as being exploited, something that is not. And again, if you look at how these behave, that polarization is evident here. So you see a large fraction of the same universe of CVEs either spiking up towards a very large exploit prediction score, which also aligns very well with them being CISA known exploits. But there's also a significant chunk on the other extreme, which is not a high EPSS. But note that CISA KEVs are actually peppered throughout this. So this is the distinction between KEV, which is a deterministic and evidential signal, versus EPSS, which is more of a predictive score. Naturally, what this means is, while these are useful signals, they are not directly useful for prioritization. They're too polarized to be able to distinguish vulnerabilities on. So an approach that might make sense would be to modulate what CVSS scores are bringing in terms of vulnerability attributes and scoring on that basis with this threat information. And if we did that, um, one approach of doing that would result in a complementary CDF that looks like this, which is, again, like I was saying earlier, read as 90% of the um, universe of CVEs have a threat modulated score of 2 or more on 10. And so therefore you see that this is now left shifted. There's definitely a smaller volume. So the median has now also shifted to below 4, between a 3 and a 4. And if you were to focus on some of the vulnerabilities at the tail end here, you would be able to start to gain some benefits of uh, using threat as a way to prioritize. And unfortunately, this in itself is not sufficient. Again, going back to the previous example, for the typical larger enterprise, this still results in about um, 270 to 300 CVEs, 80,000 instances of those affecting 10,000 assets. Still not something that could be readily addressed. For a smaller enterprise, again, the picture looks better, but still large number of instances peppered across a large fraction of the network. In addition to this, being not the best we could do, I will come to what is the best we could do. From an operational standpoint, the challenge it introduces is that you now have scores that can vary in time. So all the auditing mechanisms that have unfortunately been built upon vulnerabilities having been scored in one way, and that being a stagnant score, static, not changing score, is no longer a good enough means for us to be able to record and bookkeep. You need to be able to adapt to scores varying in time as externalities, as the threat factors change. So the second dimension in which we can do better is focusing on where things matter. And this is where bringing in business context um, is paramount, because it allows us to inform ourselves of where there is actually exposure, where the preconditions for vulnerability exploitation um, is actually met, um, what is the state of mitigations or security controls that may be deployed. So we could factor in where existing mechanisms could buy security teams more time before they could before it becomes something that they need to respond to. And also, most importantly, factoring in the consequence, the impact, the business impact of uh, what would happen if there were successful exploitation even. And this is where, if you look at a typical enterprise and you look at how impact is distributed here, I have impact on the x-axis. Ignore the units here. It could be arbitrary units. Monetary is what people could typically think of this as. But on the y-axis is the proportion of assets where there is an impact that is concentrated, that is larger than the said amount on the x-axis. So if you look at this, less than 10% of the network have an impact that is in this picture, what may be considered a hotspot for impact. And it is this asset disparity that we could turn into an advantage in being able to prioritize. And here's what would happen if we were to make use of this, right? So on the x-axis here is I'm plotting the fraction of vulnerability instances that need to be remediated. On the y-axis is the maximal residual risk, what risk remains as a fraction of what was originally the risk. And you see here that with the CVSS-based approach, until you resolve a significant fraction, about 70% of vulnerability instances, you don't make a dent in the residual risk at all. With threat factored in, that is a little bit better. So you do get some benefit a little bit early on, but it's still um, a majority of vulnerability instances that need to be resolved. On the other hand, bringing in threat as well as impact and making it a risk-based approach allows us to immediately gain substantial benefits. And if you zoom into this picture here, you see that within about 0.1% of vulnerability instances that get remediated, you start to make a big dent. And the fraction of impact that is concentrated in these selected set of uh, what I called impact hotspots, you are able to immediately take control of, and you start to keep that advantage as you go through subsequent remediation as well. And so therefore this is a logarithmic plot on the y-axis. So therefore this is the disparity here is not very apparent, but this is substantial improvement in terms of residual risk as you remediate these fraction of instances. But this comes with its own operational challenge as well, which is you now have scores that don't just vary in time, but also vary across the network. So you need to be able to distinguish scores on the basis of vulnerability instances based on what assets they are exposed on, as opposed to just treating this in the realm of vulnerabilities like a CVSS scoring system did. So to take away two key points here. First being true vulnerability prioritization in this day and age where we have seen the deluge of exploits and vulnerabilities requires a risk to be the true North Star, the guiding factor. And towards that end, you need to be able to measure these in terms of metrics. Typically, when we talk of vulnerability management metrics, people gravitate towards MTTR, mean time to remediate. But that in itself is a potentially metric. Singularly, it can be gamed. It can invoke false sense of security because you may have long-standing issues that are never resolved, only newer issues that get resolved, and your MTTR can be small. So therefore, in conjunction with MTTR, metrics such as mean open vulnerability age, MOA, are actually critical. And being able to measure this, not just for vulnerabilities, but based on where they are present, like I said, vulnerability instances matters. In a sense, I alluded to this from operationally, even from an auditing standpoint, you need to be able to now record what is to be done, not at the level of vulnerabilities, but at the level of instances. And ideally, what we could leverage in this case to manage this better is automation. And there is definitely a whole lot that could be automated here. And there is largely a recognition of this fact, and the community I see do seemingly gravitating towards more adopting more automated mechanisms on this. The second main takeaway is that you want to truly instill a sense of security as being a shared responsibility. So this is where you want to be able to decentralize the responsibility for what needs to be done. Um, Again, going back to some of the things that I mentioned here in the first takeaway, maintaining a robust risk roster where we have risk owners identified for all of the assets, um, creating a leaderboard of where uh, these performance metrics, the KPIs, are against this leaderboard, and instilling a sense of healthy competition and gamifying this is truly a a way to um, operationalize in this um, new world where we need to be able to make this a decentralized and a shared responsibility. Um, I think with that, those were the main things that I want to point out today. Uh, Back to you, Umang.
Yeah, this is awesome. This is great because I think even though I sort of I would say, not I, know about these data points. I think when you present it with real data, it allows us to think about the numbers and really wonder how people do it when you've taken a cross section across small and large enterprises. So very, very, very insightful. I do have some questions I wanted to ask. I'll start with you, Alex. I think one of the most surprising things within DBIR was what you had pointed out just before the tail end of your last slide, which is the mass exploitation of vulnerabilities. For those in CISA K, we can start in as soon as 5 days. Do you have any insights on why that is? And is it because that, CISA Kev vulnerabilities are being reactive because there are already evidence of it in the wild? Or is there any other insights on why that happens within 5 days versus others that are 68 days?
No, so yes, right. The thing about the KEV is it's called a known exploited vulnerability. So of course they add something to the list after something has been exploited or they believe that it's being exploited. So it doesn't mean a vulnerability is born on the KEV, right? Sometimes it'll take some time, they'll be exploited. And obviously there is a kind of a hindsight effect there, right? And the numbers of something on the KEV would be smaller, the time would be smaller than things outside. But the important point here is that if something is in the KEV and you haven't patched it, you're likely already late, right? This is already something that's being exploited. However, that doesn't mean that it's being mass exploited. Maybe it's not easy to be mass exploited, right? Maybe it's something that was found to be only used by like state-sponsored threat actors, let's say, to conduct very fine-grained espionage campaigns, right? But once something is out there, right, the likelihood of, especially if the exploit is being successful or is documented to being successful, the likelihood of other people also developing an exploit and also tooling their tool, putting it on their tools, just increases, right? It's just a kind of once it's out there, the gates open, right? Everybody has to be. So using the CISA KV is useful as a shorthand for critical, right? It's something that if it's there, it means that, or it's something that we absolutely have to get on top of. So yeah, I guess the answer to your question is yes.
Got it. Um, Here's another question for you that just came in. It's maybe a bit biased. Um, so the question is, let me rephrase it too. It says, which report is better to
I can see it.
either risk? Is it DBIR or Poneman's data breach report? I actually have read both, and I actually work with Poneman too. So they're very different, but I think it'd be good to articulate it because a lot of people could have this question. And I think if you take your DBI hat off for a second and answer this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question because any answer that I give is biased, right? But to your point, they are very different. They focus on very, very different things. And it has been a long time since I've read the Ponemon report. But back then, I remember that a lot of the information they had were very survey based,
That's right.
right? As in, they would ask the companies how much damages they have,
That's right.
and this is not an avenue that we went down. So if you compare the two reports, we report way less on financial damages and financial impact because we want to make sure that all the data that we have on financial impact is coming from primary sources, such as law enforcement, such as insurance, right? We're not just going out and asking people. We believe there's an intrinsic difference between those two, but at the end of the day, it might not matter for whatever use or whatever, however you're planning on using those reports for, defending a point to the board or anything like that. So yeah, clearly there is a world where both of these reports are useful and they are helpful for making us make better decisions on how to improve our security environment.
Yeah, thank you. Aravind, the next question for you. If an organization was considering a risk-based approach, as you pointed out, right? So in your approach, you clearly laid out the generations, a severity-based generation, say a predictive-based generation, and then a risk-based generation. So if someone was starting with a risk-based approach, what might be a good place to start? Should they consider a single factor, or should they take the threat factor plus the business impact factor plus the exposure factor? What's a good place to start?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question because to me, for a risk-based approach, where it fundamentally relies on is what is the business context, right? So, and this is actually an advantage because this is home turf for security teams. So it is imperative that the team is aware of what are the business impact hotspots. So in that sense, fundamentally, foundationally, you need to be having a robust inventory of what's in the network and what's part of the enterprise, uh, what uh, what assets exist, what components they are comprised of, um, what controls are in place, and where business criticality is. And if you have that as a foundational layer, you could pretty much deduce everything else from that standpoint. If you have detailed asset and asset component information, you can do a good job of inferring what the security state of those components are, what vulnerabilities are exposed, be it software-related vulnerabilities or configuration-related. In the case of users on the network, being able to monitor credential-related access control. This information is foundation and can be deduced from the inventory. And so essentially, that's the starting point, and you can add layers of enrichment on top of it, ultimately crystallizing to measuring risk in a manner that is accurate, and therefore using that in informing vulnerability management on that basis.
Got it. That's very helpful. Also, one more question for you. I think you mentioned it, but it'd be nice to double click on this because you were talking a little bit about the when you had layered on the EPSS score on CISA KEV and non-KEV vulnerabilities, there were still a fraction of them that were non-KEV vulnerabilities, and I think you clearly mentioned about the predictiveness of the EPSS score. So KEV makes sense, right? That's an insight that Alex provided too. If it's in KEV and if it's assuming it's a vulnerability that's being exploited, you go fix it. How do you deal with the non-KEV ones?
Again, good point. So I think, like I said, KEV or any of the threat signals for that matter are only one part of it. So In a robust vulnerability management operation, I think fundamentally there is four entities that are part of the equation and three risk drivers across these four entities. Foundationally, like I said, asset is the starting point. Assets exist to satisfy some business functionality, as long as that is well understood and well known. The consequence of potential compromise is also well understood. Um, Assets, unfortunately, are not always in the ideal state of not being exploited. So whenever they have a deviation from this ideal state, there are vulnerabilities that are present. So being able to enumerate those vulnerabilities, being able to look at what sort of weaknesses they expose, and on that basis, being able to determine uh, the the preconditions that need to be satisfied for exploitation, how easy it is for an adversary or an ignorant user for that matter to realize such an exploitation, and to what degree there is a compromise where, and typically this is measured in the dimensions of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, understanding where what sort of compromise is feasible and what sort of compromise on the underlying asset is damaging. That is the second entity. The third entity is threat, like we've been talking about, being able to factor in um, indicators of adversarial activity, being able to factor in exploits that may be available, to what degree they are mature, whether they are verified, unverified POCs, whether kits are being sold on the dark web. So basically access to such exploits, those things matter. And for the fourth entity, it is the security operations in itself. In a sense, um, configuration hardening approaches can inhibit exposure. Um, Deployment of security controls such as EDRs, and in fact, the security practice in terms of cadence of resolution of vulnerabilities reduces the time window for potential exploitation. And so therefore, as long as the time window is small, you have curtailed exploitability. Um, and also deployment of business continuity policies, tools for that matter, to be able to recover when there is actually an exploitation. Um, those are the at, entities and the risk drivers within those entities that need to be looked into. All of this in conjunction. And so for non-KV, only one of these entities, which is threat, there are no direct indicators. What again has been very useful for us in terms of how we deal with such vulnerabilities is to look at these attributes of vulnerabilities and see historically what has happened for similar vulnerabilities.
Got
And
it.
if there is a prevalence of exploits for, let's say, the underlying weakness that is exposed, then that's an
Makes
indicator.
sense. Makes sense. So a couple more questions, and then I think we'll be almost out of time. So this one question that just came in, if you guys are Googling it, stop doing that and answer the question. Um, so the question you probably already read, but I'll read it out for the audience sake. It's about an academic paper. I haven't heard of it. LLM agents can autonomously exploit one-day vulnerabilities, which found that in 87% of one-day CVE tested, GPT-4 was capable of creating exploits from the CVE description alone. Do you guys have a point of view on these findings and what these implications are? Even if you have not read this paper, which is possible, you could do that later. Why don't we generally talk about if it's not happening today, it could happen in the future. So the question is, one, how effective they are, how effective they could be, and two, what do we do about them? So if you believe that is happening, then what should you do about it? And one, of course, if you have heard any stories, otherwise, please, I stand corrected.
I didn't read it, but I remember it being disproven at the time. So specifically by folks who do security engineering for LLM research in Meta, there's a guy named Chris Horeth. I'm probably butchering his last name, but he has done a lot of work in exploitation building, and he's transitioned to the security team. And so he went through the paper and yeah, this is just replay. This is just, the knowledge is all there. It's just replaying the stuff that it had. So it's not creating anything novel, right? It's just really just replaying the kind of the CVEs. And again, I don't know the thoroughness of the test, right? Exactly how far they went on, oh, does this code compile? Does this code actually trigger the exploit, right? I don't know how many vulnerabilities they looked at, but again, given the amount of errors, trivial errors that are inserted into LLM generated code, I think anybody here who has done any sort of trying to use Copilot or things like that, you have to constantly fix the thing all the time, find it very unlikely that those numbers hold up.
Great, thank you. Arvind, do you have any other?
Yeah, I'd like to chime in here as well. So I largely agree with what Alex said. I have skimmed through the paper, and it looks like fairly rudimentary exploits and repetitive ones. But keeping aside what the paper and the content of the paper itself was, but what I feel has happened with this sort of a technology being readily accessible for anyone is that it has fundamentally reduced the barrier for a required skill set for someone to try to craft an exploit. It doesn't have to be something original, something ingenious uh, to be able to exploit something, create an exploit for an existing vulnerability. Even if you are able to um, copy what had been used before, it is a viable exploit. And so in that sense, there's definitely uh, a possibility that this could reduce the sophistication required for adversaries. And so as a counterpoint to that, from sorry, what this means for a vulnerability management standpoint, relying on threat indicators alone may have worked so far. How much longer they will still be useful or prudent to be relied upon is an open question. Need to see how things go. But there's definitely a sense that you may not want to confine your attention only to what is known to be exploited or what is expected to be
Right,
exploited.
right, right.
Barrier is no longer there.
Makes sense. So last question, and I asked this last question because I think no discussion these days is complete without Gen AI in the mix. So Alex, you clearly had a paragraph in the DBIR on Gen AI. How do you expect that to change in the next year? Or if you think you will have to change anything related to the findings that you're seeing, or were there any early signs of what you saw, or you think it's really, really too early to tell?
I think it's early. I think it's early, right? The kind of the gist of the argument there in the report is that not only we're not seeing any sort of mass movement in adopting Gen AI to help with exploitation or malware development or phishing. The question is, really, does it matter, right? Oh, phishing can get better. Does it need to get better, right? It's already doing a killing out there. What does 10% improvement in phishing efficiency, what difference does that make? What does coding an exploit half a day earlier than today makes a difference when you have so many 0 days and you have 5 days? So even if there is a breakthrough, right? And of course that is with the exception of any potential, oh, only an AI can do this sort of attack, which is something I am fairly skeptical of. Of course, it's not my job to come up with what is the AI specific attack. That's the AI's job. Maybe that's why I'm not an AI, but so I cannot conceptualize it. But on the kind of the normal stuff we're dealing on day to day, right? I struggle to find a way that it's going to make an impact, right? So it's that, and it's definitely not a case of, oh, you can only beat a bad AI with a good AI. Absolutely not as well, right? That's not the stance that people should be having either. So again, we're keeping an eye on it, right? There's a lot of discussion recently about the true effectiveness of those tools, right? Will the scaling laws hold and all of that? So, and I mean, it's our job is to try to figure out and try to predict and try to understand if there is going to be a change anytime soon. Doesn't seem like that's the case.
Great. And then sort of building on that for Aravind, the attacker side data says too early. Defender side says we're ready, or do you have another answer?
Yeah, I have a more bullish sentiment on this. I think primarily what Alex is also hinting at is that a lot of these use cases require precision, and that is something that we've still not seen AI systems deliver. They are definitely good where there is scope for creativity and imprecision. And this is seen in almost every use case that is discussed today in terms of chat GPTs or the stable diffusions and the image generations and things of that sort. Definitely more useful there. But in the realm of security, where precision is required, I think there's still some challenges that need to be addressed before they are completely usable. But the reason for me being bullish is that it's also true that a lot of the security information and data exchange or data that is generally available in terms of in the security context in the internet is very textual in nature. And that's where I think fundamentally being able to comb through a large volume of this data and being able to identify elements where um, attention is to be paid or being able to make inferences in terms of, okay, potentially this sort of a compromise is feasible, or this from, let's say, from an uh, standpoint of being able to analyze what adversarial techniques could potentially be employed on the basis of just textual information about description of some scenario. I think we've definitely been experimenting with and have found success in it being able to produce reasonable results. And so that's something that I think is definitely um, going to be a key element in the security toolbox.
Awesome. Well, just to kind of close off this close off this webinar, I wanted to thank you guys for being here. For all the attendees, if you're interested in learning more about a risk-based approach to vulnerability management, we have one too. Love for you guys to sign up for a demo if you're interested. We could show you how we do it. Aravind and his team work really hard on not just prioritizing risk, but considering many different factors, many of which are then powered and made or developed with AI from a defender's lens. If we could help you mitigate these vulnerabilities and do them faster, that would be, that would help the community in large, and that's why we are here. But thanks again to our panelists, and thanks again to all the attendees for sticking with us for the last 55 minutes. And I want to give you guys 4 minutes back so you can get on with your day and with your next meeting. And thanks again for everyone to being here.
Thanks, Suman. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Aravind.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.